Hey everyone, Shaun Stevenson here, author of the Throne series, and today we're talking about an alien book because I was in the mood for some alien, just monster mystery kind of books, and so I read one for Old School April 2025, and that is book number 1 in the Mindwarp series, Alien Terror by Chris Archer. Now, first of all, we got to talk about this book cover. Because if you can see this, there's this shiny part of this book cover that is so amazing and also so 90s. It's incredible. And I really, really, really liked it. Now, I gotta say, this book was really interesting to me because this book in particular had a tonal issue. And we're going to get into that. First, though, this book is about a kid named Ethan Rogers who is super into the X-Men. It is like his whole personality is comic books and the X-Men. He loves reading the comics of the X-Men. He's on the hunt for the original first edition of the very first X-Men comic. That is the book that he wants more than anything else. There's a comic book shop at the mall that he's been going to and like looking at this comic book so many times, wishing that he could just have that one copy of that first edition of the X-Men comic book. So Ethan Rogers, he is all about the X-Men and he's all about inner monologues. So Ethan Rogers, he is just living his life in the small town when there's some strange stuff starting to go on in town. There's some interesting people showing up in town that he's not quite sure what's going on, why they seem to be following him in particular, and has he had some kind of an encounter with an alien? That is the real question. And I gotta say, this book was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed reading it. It is the most jam-packed 90s references book that you will ever read in your life. So if you are looking for a book from the 90s that's like a middle grade read, you know, that 120, 140 page kind of book that has tons of 90s references, Alien Terror is the book you want. Everything in here is referenced from like Super Soaker 2000s, which I did never have. I was always very sad about that. I loved our old Super Soaker. In fact, I remember this one time in this mobile home park that we grew up in, there was this guy who had just gotten a Super Soaker 2000. And so all the kids in the neighborhood were like, get your Super Soakers. We're taking him down. And so all of us kids were like running around with Super Soakers trying to get this guy who had a Super Soaker 2000 hooked up to a kiddie pool with a hose. It was a whole thing. It was hilarious. It was like one of the other kids' dads or something. But it was so much fun. And you have like Super Nintendo games referenced here, like specific, really specific games referenced. You have stores that are referenced that don't exist anymore that are from the 90s. Candy, toys, books, movies. So much 90s nostalgia in one Alien Terror book. I kind of couldn't believe it, to be honest with you. I was like, wow, that is a lot of references to the 90s. And this was written in the 90s. So it definitely is a product of its time, but it was so fun because there were things that they mentioned in the book that I thought, oh yeah, I forgot about that until I read about it in the book again. So if you're looking for a blast to the past, this is quite the book to read. Now, what about the tonal issue though that I talked about? This book definitely does have a tonal issue. And what I mean by that is the book starts out as one thing and ends as something completely different. And I just did not know what to do with that. So at the beginning of the book, this is not a spoiler, but at the beginning of the book, this book was a lot more comedic than I thought it was going to be. And I don't say funny because I didn't really laugh out loud or even chuckle at much of the comedic elements. It was more just like, I'm trying to be a funny book and say funny things. And Ethan Rogers, the main character, is the king of comic book monologues. You have these sections in the beginning when all of a sudden the typeface changes, and at least it's not Comic Sans. I was thinking about that. But the typeface suddenly changes, and then it's all different, like, inner monologues from Ethan, but in a comic book panel style. It's as if he was reading a comic book and then talking about his life in those panel kind of sections. And I did not expect that. I expected from the cover of this book for a spooky alien storyline, which we do get, but not until halfway through. There is a moment about halfway through where everything changes and all the monologues drop to the wayside, and now it's a alien horror kind of book. And I thought, what is happening? I liked the second half of this book a lot better than the first half of this book. A lot of the first half I thought, okay, I think I know where we're going here. And it did go where I thought it was going to go. But then the second half of this book had such interesting things happening. And it has a finale battle that was excellent. I kept thinking the entire time while I was reading the final chapters of this book, like, where has this book been? Because this is amazing. It's such a great final sequence with like this leading to this kind of battle sequence. It just was so much fun. I really, really enjoyed the end of it. But the beginning was rough with all of those comic book monologues, which I'm not the biggest superhero comic book reader. I like superhero movies, but I'm not super into reading the comic books of those stories. I more like the films of that kind of stuff. So I'm just not really into that superhero comic book scene, and it's not because I think they're bad or anything. I just don't prefer them personally. I like other kinds of comic book stories, which maybe we'll talk about someday. But for now, we're talking about Alien Terror, and at the end of this book, it does end in a great way and on a cliffhanger, because unlike many other series from the 90s, this one is a continuing series. So book 1 leads straight into book 2, which leads into book 3, and on throughout the series. You don't have as many books in this series. I believe it's 10 from what I can tell, but this series was a good beginning. A little bumpy because we kind of know what we're doing. Now, I also have to say that the comic book elements, by the end of the book, I understood what Chris Archer was doing with them. And from like a technical 30,000 foot view of it, it's pretty genius storytelling. Like I thought, okay, that's really smart what you did. I see what you're doing there. I can see the bones of that. And that actually works well. I just didn't like it personally because it's like comic booky. But then when it changes into this alien horror story, I loved it. And I saw what they were doing at the beginning of the book and I thought, okay, I see what you're doing. The character growth there, that fits really well with what's happening later on in the book. And I'm here for it. Now that we're at the second half of the book, some things have been revealed that I was expecting to be revealed, and here we go. So this one's an interesting one. If you're a fan of Animorphs and Goosebumps, you might like this. Although I will say this book was more intense than a Goosebumps book. More like Animorphs. If you've read any Animorphs books, you know that those can get pretty intense sometimes. There's stakes, there are things that happen to characters that are really dramatic and pretty scary sometimes in Animorphs. And this was more similar to that in the second half of the book than at the beginning of the book. There also are some gruesome scenes. There's like a couple scenes that I was like, whoa, I can't believe you did that in a kid's book. Like, that's pretty gruesome. But at the end of the day, I did enjoy this book. So it's kind of a mixed bag. I think if you can get through the beginning, get through the comic book stuff, or if you like comic book stuff, you might really enjoy it. But get through that comic book stuff at the beginning of the book, and if you like alien horror, you're going to love the end of this book, especially if you love a good splash of the 90s. So at the end of the day, I would give Alien Terror a solid 3.5 out of 5 stars. I think it was solid, it was good, a great beginning, but it does suffer from being the beginning book. And I think once I get to book 2, things now that have been established, we're going to keep moving on. And I haven't looked, but I really hope Chris Archer dropped the whole comic book monologue thing. I just really hope that goes away because I think it was not necessary and just kind of dragged down the beginning of the book into kind of a comedic tone that for me didn't really work. I was more here for the alien horror and the 90s references than anything else, and that was a lot of fun. So, until next time, everybody, keep reading. Bye!